Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, North America's first attempted city. Well, today we're going to begin a series about county government and how it was developed and how it grew here in Escambia County. And for that, we have to take ourselves into an adventure down in what we now call Plaza Ferdinand VII, downtown Pensacola. And the date was the 17th day of July in 1821. And there in the square that day were about 700 people, the whole population of Pensacola as it stood that time. And opposite the flagpole on the one side was a troop of soldiers, the militia from the Spanish government, which was, of course, outgoing on that day. And opposite the flagpole again was a troop of infantry commanded by General Andrew Jackson, who was the incoming governor of Territorial Florida. These people came together. A ceremony was conducted right at 10 o'clock. The band played, the flag went up, and now Pensacola and all of Florida was part of the United States. Now at this time, Andrew Jackson stepped back. He had two interpreters with him, Spanish and French, and he went about the job of, first of all, telling the population there that as of that day, they were citizens of the United States, if they wished to be. And secondly, he began to detail how the territory was to be governed. And bear in mind, now the territory extended all the way to the Florida Keys. It's a long piece of territory. Now, then first of all, he spent a few minutes detailing how city government was to be operated. And he had a charter for the city. He also named the men who were appointed for the first 9 months to be city councilmen. And then he turned to the subject of county government. Now, he told the population that as a beginning, all of Florida was to be divided in two. And Escambia County was to run from the western border to the Suwannee River, and St. Johns County would run from the river down to the Keys. Then he said, now, I am today going to appoint 3 men who are going to act as county commissioners. They are going to have the jurisdiction over building and maintaining roads, bridges, and ferries from the border all the way to the Suwannee River. Now, looking at that at this moment, you'd say, well, now that was a tremendous job. The 350 miles, 3 men, how are they going to possibly do this with the primitive communications they had? And the answer was, it wasn't very hard to start with because basically there were no roads, bridges, and ferries. This was just something that was put on the record as a goal for something to be developed. Well, they started. And as the county government was put together, here's basically what they had. The provision was made, first of all, for a sheriff. Now, the sheriff, or marshal, as it was to be called at first, was not appointed by the governor, this governor, but was to be subsequently appointed by future territorial governors out of the state capital. And the marshal was to have 2 jobs. He was to be the peacekeeper across the territory, and he was also to be the tax collector. And that's the way things would move on that dual role for the next 25 years. Now, in addition to being marshal or sheriff, this man was to have jurisdiction over a series of posses. And as Andrew Jackson explained it, the entire white population from 18 to 45 was to be divided into teams, teams of 5, 6, 7 men, and they would be called to action if there was some disturbance of the peace where that sort of service was needed. Now, bear in mind, these men were not to be paid. They provided their own horses, and you can see how cost-conscious the early government was because there were no deputies. The sheriff or marshal was there doing the job himself, and he could call on posses as they were needed. And that's exactly the way things happened. Secondly, the marshal was to have the use of what was called the old Spanish calaboza or jail, which is down on Alcany Street. And the county commission was to have a budget to take care of paying for a jailer and also someone usually on the outside, a private contractor who would provide food for those persons who were arrested and placed in jail. Now, bear in mind, in those early years, It was the practice of local government, and this continued on for some time, to try and avoid any sentence that put the person in jail. Putting him in jail costs money. So basically what would happen that the person who was convicted of a minor charge would perhaps be put in the pillory and stocks for several hours, or he or she might be whipped in public. And that's basically the way things would be operated. Now, looking at things that the county didn't have, and we want to mention that at the beginning as a contrast of how things would develop. Bear in mind that at this point in time, the county had no operation whatsoever that dealt with education, with health, with sanitation, with building streets inside the city, with the port. None of that had anything to do with county operations, basically roads, bridges, and ferries to start with. Now, they did have one road. They had a semblance of a road, and of course this was what was called the Old Spanish Trail. And the people of the new people in Pensacola, especially those that had an English or American background, were very anxious now for the new city of Pensacola to have access to the United States mail. And there was a track that ran across northwest Florida all the way basically to Jacksonville. The Corps of Engineers was assigned to improve that as quickly as possible, and happily we do have a report from that one of the engineers who was in charge of this. It was dated 1823, and basically what he was telling us was it wasn't much of a road. It was a track, not a road, and consequently to improve it was going to take a lot of money, and it did, and over time that was what had happened. Now, the third thing that Mr. Jackson put in front of people that day was that the entire territory was to be governed by what was known as a Territorial Assembly. This was to be of 13 men chosen from all over the territory. Pensacola would have its delegates, so would St. Augustine, and the total of 13 was set, and the initial roster was approved by the Congress. And the first assembly was to begin here the following April the 1st of 1822. Well, I won't go into the entire story of what happened then. That really wasn't county government, but I will tell you that they had all kinds of trouble getting here. One of the persons involved was killed on the way. As soon as they got here, they were beset by yellow fever. And the one thing that these men agreed to was that the arrangement to hold annual meetings and have them alternate between Pensacola and St. Augustine was very difficult. Their decision was, we have to have a capital city that is more centrally located. And so basically teams were sent out, one coming from the east going west, the other coming from Pensacola going east, and basically where they met turned out to be the site of the state capital, and that of course is where Tallahassee is today, and basically that's how we got Tallahassee as our capital. Well, as we move forward into this first week or two with the new governance here, the county began to take form. Andrew Jackson remained here only 90 days. Basically, beyond that, the men that he appointed, the sheriff and others, tax collector and so on, were put in place, and they began their work. Now, bear in mind, at the beginning, there was a question of how would county government pay for itself. Now, basically, the idea was, of course, this was taken from English history and colonial history along the Atlantic. They were going to establish a system of taxation built on property. Ad valorem taxes were to be assessed. Assessment was to be made. A tax assessor would determine what the levels were. The county commissioners would make the decision on what the rate would be, the ad valorem rate, and then the tax collector would collect it. Now, it sounds simple enough. Basically, we have to remember, however, that there was precious little here for people to tax. Almost all of the money, all of the land was owned either going to be owned either by the state or the federal government, or it was going to be in large estate type units that were holdovers from the Spanish government. And one of the most interesting things that our local government did, this wasn't county government per se, but it reflected the county and federal action, was to try and determine who really owned these large pieces of land. Because you kind of have to picture how things might have been in about 2 to 3 years before the American takeover of Florida. some people were frantic. They wanted to get out. They were sure that things were going to be bad for them under the American rule. They wanted to get out and sell out. And others were coming in saying, we're going to have an absolute boom here once the Americans are here. Just a conflict like this. And so there was all sorts of frantic transactions, so much so that the United States Congress said, now wait a minute, we can't have that. And as of a given date in 1818, they put a stop to that. They said no transaction will be recognized after this date. And when Andrew Jackson came, three of the offices that he had to fill immediately were the office of what they called land commissioners. And these men were to sit in judgment over these land disputes. And one would say, well, that's a simple enough job. Well, these three commissioners arrived here and found that they didn't have a half a dozen or a dozen. They had hundreds of such disputes. So they immediately asked the United States Congress to appoint other commissioners to help them, which they did. And I can only tell you that it took all the way to 1849, 28 years before the last of those disputes were taken care of. And the last big one involved the one that a company that we had talked about in an earlier episode, the Forbes and Company, the successors of Penton and Leslie. They had taken in exchange for debt from the Creek tribes and from the Spanish government. They had taken a trade-off, if you will, of about 1.25 million acres from each one, and this land was over near Apalachicola, and that was to have been the payback for the loans that Forbes and Company had made. Unfortunately for them, ultimately the land commissioners and then the United States federal courts decided against them, and basically that's what brought the arrangement with the Forbes Company and as a company here to an end. Now, as all of this is going on, the early part of the 1820s, Mr. Jackson does his thing. He departs. He is succeeded by William Duval as the territorial governor, and now things begin to develop in Pensacola. Some of these, of course, we will have discussed in other episodes. It is now that President Monroe has issued his Monroe Doctrine, 1823, and when that happens, of course, we had the United States Navy was to establish a Navy Yard here, and the Navy Yard was to be protected by a series of forts. And all of this begins to happen here in the early part of the 1820s, so that by the time we go through those first years, we have all of this kind of action, and as you start building a fort, or rather a Navy Yard, and you start building forts, of course, you're bringing in additional people, and so the population is beginning to grow for all of Escambia County. As all of this is moving forward, and Colonel Chase, Captain Chase rather, and Mr. Warrington are helping set up local businesses to provide brick and lumber. And now, when you see those businesses come into place most of them up along the Escambia River, now you see new places coming into action that are going to pay taxes. These are taxable elements that begin to bring the money into the county coffers to pay their bills. Now, it's interesting to get a little bit of a handle on how much money was involved. Well, we have, as I mentioned, we have a tax assessor and a tax collector, and in those first few years, the annual collection of taxes. Now remember, of course, money was different back in those days. The annual collection of taxes never exceeded $30,000. So you get an idea that the collection and the values of property rather, were relatively small. But as all of this proceeded, Navy is coming into being, and as is the fortification protection. At the same time, we had another action that did begin with when Mr. Jackson was still present, and that was a group of leading citizens coming together and making application to the United States Bank for permission to have a charter and a chartered bank here in Pensacola, because everybody realized, well, we can hardly see business being improved and fostering our economy unless we've got a bank. Well, unfortunately for them, the people at the United States Bank never answered their request, and so it would be more than 12 years after Mr. Jackson accepted the territory before we did have a bank here in Pensacola to make things proceed. And of course, that was the success of bringing into being the Bank of Pensacola was a big thing for Pensacola, and we're going to talk about that at the beginning of our second episode, which will be with you shortly.